People describe the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to them. Like and subscribe to support us. I was 6 years old and I was in the car with my mother, grandmother, and my cousin. It was 1979 and it was October. Someone ran a stop sign and my mother swerved to miss them and hit a telephone pole. The only image I have of my mother is her slumped over the steering wheel and blood pouring out of her face. My cousin was sitting next to me was screaming at the top of her lungs. I don't remember seeing my grandmother. My mother and her mother both died that day. My cousin had her hip broken in numerous places. I had a sprained/broken, not 100% sure anymore, wrist, broken collarbone and some glass in me. That image terrifies me to this day. My lung collapsed spontaneously. It felt like a pulled muscle in my shoulder, so I went home from work and went to bed after taking some painkillers. Woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom, and could barely pull myself out of bed. Eventually managed it, but passed out on the way and got found in a heap at the top of the stairs by my parents. They sat with me for a minute, then after seeing that I was okay, I wasn't, but I'm a dick and didn't want to scare them, went back to bed. In the morning I was in loads of pain, so they took me to a walk-in clinic. After an hour and a half wait where I turned yellow and was blacking out, I saw a doctor who immediately called an ambulance. I had emergency surgery on a ward where a doctor stuck a tube through my ribs into my lung, which spurted a good pint or so of blood down her front. I then had to carry the tube with a bucket on the end around hospital with me for 3 weeks. My lung got infected and I almost had to have the whole thing removed. This was a few weeks before my 19th birthday. I'm now 24 and totally fine, although I'm not allowed to scuba dive or be an astronaut. I was 8, my sister was 6. We were crawling across the top of the monkey bars in our backyard. Our parents were inside eating. My sister was wearing a bicycle helmet and either decided to jump down or fell through the bars. She didn't fall all the way to the sawdust though, which I thought was weird, but from where I was, I didn't have a very good view of everything. I crawled to where she went through and looked down to see the back of her bicycle helmet caught on a level support bar for the swing set, which was part of the same structure, and the neck strap was strangling her. I clearly remember that she was kicking her legs, but that she was making no noise, nothing. I couldn't figure out what to do. I wasn't tall enough to pull her off from the ground, so I had to work from above. I lowered my body through the monkey bars and kicked the back of the bar and helmet, sending her flying face first into the sawdust maybe 8 feet below. She immediately started coughing and crying, but she was physically alright. We haven't spoken about it since that night. When I was in Russia, I was on my way to Moscow from St. Petersburg with some friends. We stopped at a McDonald's on the road. I know. You're supposed to do Russian things in Russia, but this was seriously the first stop we'd come across and we were all starving. We pulled up and grabbed something to eat. We were all hanging around and I noticed 2 of my guy friends were chatting with some Russian dudes at their car. I'm watching this from inside because I'm waiting to use the bathroom. One Russian was clearly pretty drunk. He was wearing a t-shirt and it was November, in Russia. Near Moscow. I have never been so cold in my life, and he was with 3 other guys. They were all pretty huge and they all got out of the car to chat with my 2 friends. I finally get to use the bathroom and when I come out, I notice my friends are not talking with these dudes anymore and are heading back to the car. The Finn we were traveling with starts honking the horn to let us know we should head out, so I start heading towards the car. I have to go past these Russians who by now are all hanging around their car smoking. As I pass, one of them waves at me and I wave back. They say something in Russian but I have no idea what it is, and then one of them lunges at me, grabs me, picks me up, and starts trying to shove me into their car. I'm a pretty small girl but I start struggling and fighting back and screaming. My 2 friends start running back to where I am and the Finn pulls the car forward. I'm just struggling and trying not to let them push me through the door. One of them has gotten into the driver's seat and started their car, but I'm still half hour of the vehicle as my friends rush up and pull the guy, and me in his arms, back from the car. I guess they had thought that I was alone and maybe easy prey, but then they realized that I was with 3 guys. He put me down and put his hands up, and tried to laugh it off and smile as my friends pull me back behind them and try to be menacing. We all get in the car and pull away. The Finn let me know I was lucky, and that white slavery is a big problem in Russia, and that I should definitely never travel alone. I was calm through the whole incident, but the scariest thing that happened to me was slicing an artery in half with a knife while at work. The amount of blood that cascaded out was nothing like I've ever seen. I had my other hand covering the slice on my wrist, putting pressure on it. I told a coworker I need to go to the hospital now, but he thought I was exaggerating and asked me to let him see it. I took my hand off, which relieved the pressure, and blood shot about 4 feet in the air and splattered everywhere like a volcano. At the ER, the idiot at the counter tried to make me fill out paperwork before a doctor saw me. I said no, I need to see a doctor now. The doctor had me lie down, and asked the same thing my coworker said. So I warned him the blood will shoot out if I let go of it. He said it's okay, so I complied. Blood spewing everywhere, he ran around the room looking for gauze and screaming for help. I had emergency surgery about 20 minutes later and they were able to reattach the artery back together and it worked fine. I was out of the hospital and back to work the next day. My whole arm turned black from all the blood that had leaked into the arm and I had to hold my arm up over my head for a week or so to let it all drain out. The scariest part was the anesthesiologist telling me there was a chance I could die on the operating table because of blood loss, so I told him to hurry up then. When I was 17 I got stung by a yellow jacket on the top of my head. This wasn't a big deal, I had been stung many times before. I went upstairs feeling a little woozy, thinking it was simply because the bite was on my head. I called my, now ex-boyfriend and was talking to him. I happened to look down at my arm and noticed bumps were starting on it. Thinking it was weird and still feeling really messed up in the head, I wandered downstairs to tell my mom, all while still talking to my BF. I get into the kitchen, she takes one look at me, shrieks and tells me we're going to the hospital. By the time we get to the hospital literally every part of my body is covered in hives, my head is pounding with blood and my throat is starting to close. Luckily they hooked me up to some Benadryl and I was okay. I learnt then that it is entirely possible to develop a life-threatening allergy past infancy/childhood. Now I'm allergic to bees and wasps and it sucks. In hindsight, this was probably scariest for my ex. I had to leave him hanging with nothing more than an I've got to go, but still, having been relatively healthy my entire life, it was scary as shit. Back in '91 my country was at war, and for a couple of months my parents, my brother and myself were living in our neighbor's basement with 2 other families. My city was surrounded from 3 sides and shelled by artillery fire on a daily basis. My neighborhood was on the edge of the city and it was about a kilometer or so from the front line. I was 13 at the time and old enough to understand what was happening, but still not old enough to be afraid as much as I probably should have been. When this particular incident happened, the hostilities have been going on for several months and we kind of learned to live with the daily shelling. It was nothing like the life we had during the peacetime, but we were still allowed to play outside. We were hardly allowed to leave our street, though, and we were still having fun. We were scared, of course, and we learned to run back to safety as soon as we would hear the artillery shells being fired from the enemy positions. Well, sort of. We could assume where the shells were fired from, depending on whether it was mortar, tanks, AA artillery, multiple rocket launchers, MRLs, or howitzers. By that assumption, we could further assume how dangerous these shells would probably be. I mean, tank shells were fairly safe, as long as you weren't standing in front of the first row of houses facing the enemy, as they can't be lobbed over the houses, and neither they can go through the house without exploding. 60mm mortars were also fairly safe as they were used to shell a different part of the city, due to their short range. Howitzers, 80mm and 120mm mortars and MRLs were a gamble. We were well within the range and, for all that we knew, they could easily be landing right on our heads within a couple of seconds. And we were all playing this unspoken, macabre game of chicken. You didn't want to be the first one to run home when you heard the shell being fired. I could only guess how other felt, but I was scared shitless. For some strange reason, however, the prospect of being ridiculed by my peers was at the time much stronger than the urge to run back to safety, so I silently played the game just as everybody else did. So when the first shell would be fired, and we would recognize that they were of the dangerous kind, everybody would try to pretend not to be afraid. In reality, we'd all be anxious to hear it land. If it would land somewhere fairly far away, you'd hear the cool kids knowing guesses of which part of the city it landed on. Quite often, it would be a single shot. It was just the enemy reminding us that they're still there and that there's still a war going on. If other shots would follow, it probably meant shit is about to hit the fan and we should probably go home. Not too fast though, you don't want to be the chicken. If the second one would land closer than the previous one, chances are the next one will fall closer still. If you didn't yet hear the shrapnel clanking on the roof, you were probably okay, as it didn't land a block away. But if you did, you were right to expect to hear the next one shrieking down, and this means that it's landing very fucking close. To this day, I swear, this is by far the most horrifying sound I ever heard in my life. A short, intense, loud, unearthly shriek, followed by a deafening explosion, further followed by a sound of shrapnel drumming on the roofs of nearby houses. So the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. It began as a fairly quiet day. quiet enough for me to get my parents to let me go to my friend's house one street away. I was going to lend some movies from him, and as I was going through his tapes, the firing started. And you could hear it was a MRL, as the shots were being fired in rapid succession. Thing with MRLs is that the rockets land uniformly across a surface, each of the 32 rockets falling within a given distance from the previous one. Being 128mm caliber, each of these rockets can cause some pretty bad shit where they fall. The first salvo was pretty intense, but it didn't last too long. 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Maybe less, maybe more. It was followed by a few minutes of complete silence. I was very scared. We didn't go to their basement, as they didn't use it as a shelter, so we were sitting in their living room and I felt like naked. Very vulnerable. All of a sudden we heard somebody opening their door, and I saw my dad coming in. For some reason, he had a gun in his holster. To this day, I don't know why he took it. Must have been a shock. Without too many words, we said goodbye. He took the tapes I borrowed from my friend, and we briskly went out of the house and towards our shelter home, which was less than a minute away. We didn't walk 20 meters when we heard another salvo being fired. Instinctively, both of us started running like crazy. It was MRL again, and less than a few seconds in our run, we could hear the first one land, not too close, but still not far enough to feel too relieved. The next one fell closer, and both of us realized that this means that the next one is falling closer still. We were running as fast as we could as each new explosion was getting louder and more terrifying. Seconds felt like days and the shelter seemed kilometers away. The next explosion I heard was probably the loudest one I ever heard, and I could hear the all too loud rattle of shrapnel on the roofs. Anticipating the next one to fall on my head, I took a dive as I heard it shriek down and explode loudly somewhere very close. I hardly have hit the ground when my father, still running behind me, grabbed me by my shirt and lifted me up without even slowing down, not uttering a single word. We continued to run, as we heard the next explosion a bit less loud than the previous one. Seconds later, we both stormed into the safety of our shelter. I don't think I left the shelter the following week. I was 14 or so and was in the backyard with my parents and some people they had over to visit. We had a few dogs running around in the backyard and one of them started acting really strange. He was standing in the middle of it under one of the trees. The dogs usually spent most of their time running up and down the fenced edges, and was spinning around, biting at the air, etc. Curious as to what was wrong, and started walking towards him and realized he must be biting or chasing at some sort of insect. Well, the next step I took, my foot sank into the ground and I heard a loud crunch from underneath. The next sound that filled my ears was the sudden, angry droning of dozens, hundreds of angry honeybees. First I felt one sting, then another, then I was in the middle of an entire swarm. I turned in place to the people across the yard, yelled, "There's bees out here," and took off running as fast as I could towards the back door of the garage, a giant swarm of bees right on top of me, stinging me left and right. I get inside and look down, horrified, to see the entire front of my t-shirt and my jeans covered in bees. It was like one of those bee beards you see in videos, where they're all clinging on like a buzzing curtain. Yet they're also stinging me through my shirt. Instinctively I try to brush my hands over my shirt to get them off, but there are simply too many, and now I have stings all over my hands, my arms, everywhere. I briefly thought about trying to head to the shower, but I didn't want to wait one more second to get these damn bees off of me, and I figured most of them might stay attached to my clothes. So I took a deep breath and pulled my bee-covered t-shirt up over my head and off. As you might imagine, the bees did not appreciate this at all. Now I had bee stings all over my face, my eyebrows, my lips. Once I get my shirt off, my course is set. The garage is now filled with bees, so I blaze a path from the garage into the kitchen of the house, and the next piece of clothing to go is my pants. Leave a trail of clothing and bees behind as I run desperately through the house, shoes flying off, socks flying off, screaming all the way until I make it to my parents' bedroom, slam the door shut behind me to keep out any trailing bees, and collapse on my parents' bed, stripped naked down to my tighty whities. Breathe, I tell myself. Just breathe. I'm exhausted. My whole body aches and I've got stings everywhere. I tried to count but lost track. There must have been over 100. Had I been allergic, I'd probably have been dead, but even a normal human being subject to that many stings at once can become seriously ill. My parents finally came instead and started cleaning up the mess. I guess most of the bees instead died quickly, but the nest outside still had to be dealt with. I just lay there, tired and aching, for over an hour. I think I was in mental shock as much as physical. Eventually I got up and got dressed. Slowly. Soon I recovered. Most of the stings were gone in a day or two, but I had a couple of really nasty ones that were swollen for days, including one on my eyebrow and another from a bee that somehow managed to get under the waistband of my shorts, stinging me right there in the bladder as he was crushed. I hate bees. I was a noob going for a little hike up a hill with my dad and amongst the Rockies. Long story short, we got in over our heads. What we thought was a hill was the nose of a huge mountain. Yes, it is possible to see a hill and not be able to see from some angles that it is part of a monster mountain. There was no way to come down the way we came. We had to keep climbing until we could get to the top of the part we were climbing and come down another way. The scariest part was a time when I was trying to catch my breath and had only a 2 or 3 inches ledge for 1 foot and a couple little places for my hands. I made the mistake of looking down. The drop wasn't straight like a cliff face, but it was almost that steep and certainly way too steep to stop any fall. I would have tumbled down 20 or 30 stories bashing myself on rock the whole way. The mixture of fear and exhaustion, this was after almost 3 hours of climbing for our lives, caused my foot to start twitching and shaking its way off of the little ledge. The other foot was already just dangling in the air with nowhere to go. My dad was blocking any further climbing, catching his breath and evaluating the next move. I was watching my foot shake itself off and finally blurted, "Dad, I need to be where you are right now." He found a way to get higher up and I found the strength to make it to where he was, a slightly better place to pause. I knew I was asking something risky of him, making him move without being prepared. So in addition to my own physical fear, I was terrified that I might cause him to fall. We both made it, and shortly after we were through the hardest part and then got to the top area we originally set out for. My mom, my wife and my daughter were 10 minutes away shopping. I was very scared for my dad. I was very scared for myself. But the real terrifying part was thinking of my wife explaining to my 2-year-old that I wasn't coming back. That was about 1,000 times more terrifying than the fear of physical pain from falling. I was taking the engine out of a '76 Firebird. I was around 19 to 20 years old and had worked on cars quite a bit growing up and was comfortable underneath a car. I was working on removing the motor mount bolts from underneath, when in a split second I realized I was rocking the car while trying to break the rusty motor mount bolts, and at the same instant I recalled I also had forgotten to use jack stands. The moment I realized this is the moment the car rocked too far and came down on my chest. This car was lowered a bit, and while it didn't break any ribs, it knocked a little bit of the last breath I was able to take as it was coming down. I concluded if I screamed I probably wouldn't be able to inhale much, but I wasn't able to hold it much longer anyway, so I screamed like a person who believes they are dying screams. Thankfully 2 family friends just so happened to pull up in the driveway at the moment this was happening. 2 buddies grabbed each side of the front of the car and picked it up just enough for me to slide out, but not before dropping it once on me. Moral of the story, always use jack stands. I worked as an assistant manager for a big retail company, but small store, a couple years ago during the holiday season. It was a really rainy morning after a huge sales day and no one was around. It was eerily quiet as I put away some items. I stopped myself for a moment and thought, this is a perfect opportunity for a thief to come in here and rob me. Well, it was one of my few predictions to become as true as it did. A matter of 10 or 20 minutes later a man entered the store fully covered except for his eyes. I could hear the fear in his voice and sense it in his eyes, and that terrified me considering he had a gun up to my face. Disbelief came before fear, however. I couldn't imagine I would ever be in this situation. I immediately started opening the register while assuring him he could have whatever he wanted. I also instinctively kept my eyes away from him because I didn't want him to think I was trying to remember him to identify him. I figured I'd rather survive this than make him nervous and blast me in his own defense. After giving him a bag full of money he told me to turn around and get on my knees. It was at this moment I thought I was going to be executed in a fucking retail store. I didn't know what to do. As soon as I heard him say and count to 100, I had rest assured he just wanted me to stay this way so he could get away unseen. I don't know how long I even stayed this way before I felt it was safe enough to turn around and phone the police. It was pretty fucking scary. I haven't worked retail since, and as a matter of fact I moved on to start my career in technology, and I couldn't be happier. I guess some things do happen for a reason, right? Toss up between 2 events. First one was around grade 6 I think. I started getting a pain in my lower back and legs. After a week or 2, the pain started to get more intense, to the point where I couldn't walk anymore. I was taken to the hospital, and was fully paralyzed from the waist down, and had trouble moving my upper body. I had so many blood tests that I lost count, and the doctors, with their little minions that follow them around like a pack of wolves, were terrifyingly intimidating. I was continuously told that they had no idea what was wrong with me. A month after being in the hospital, I started being able to walk again. I'm fine now, but they have no idea besides a couple of guesses as to what happened. Second happened on a sailboat. I race on a sailboat every week, but we had an incompetent race committee one night. The races were run by volunteers, that started a race even though there was thunder and lightning in the distance to the east. The general rule is that if you can see lightning or hear thunder in the area, get your ass back to shore, otherwise you're a 40-foot tall lightning rod in the middle of the lake. But, they were idiots and started the race anyway. A few minutes into the race, lightning is visible to the west. Yes. Lightning to the east and west of our location, with dark clouds overhead, and they still didn't cancel the race. Our crew didn't feel comfortable and started to motor as quickly as possible back to shore, as some of the other boats did. Suddenly, lightning strikes directly in front of a boat that my cousin was on, probably only 100 feet away from our boat. Immediately everyone headed back to shore. On the way back to land, you could hear buzzing in the rigging of the boats from the static electricity in the clouds. I found out later that my cousin and everyone on board had been mildly shocked from holding wet ropes at the time of the strike, and all instruments on board had been fried. I cannot emphasize how terrifying it is to be 10 minutes from land, being basically attached to a 40-foot metal pole in the air.